Careful there. Country waitress, if you spill coffee on a $1 billion suit, could you ever afford it? The sneer sliced through the diner's hum as Sophie Miller's hands shook not from nerves, but from the weight of a long night on her feet. To the customers, she was just a shadow in a faded uniform. A 25-year-old, nobody in a nowhere town unworthy of their glance. But minutes later, when two armed robbers crashed through the door and the room dissolved into screams, Sophie stood tall. In just 15 seconds, she dropped them both clean and calm, forcing Richard Hale, the cold billionaire, to make a decision that left everyone stunned. Sophie's blonde hair was pulled back tight, no strands loose like she'd learned to keep everything in place. Her waitress uniform, a gray polyester thing, hung loose on her frame, stained with coffee and ketchup from a double shift. Her canvas shoes, once white, were scuffed gray, the soles worn thin from months of pacing the diner's cracked floor. She moved with a quiet purpose, setting Richard's coffee down without a word, her hands steadying as she caught her rhythm. The diner was a small place, neon lights buzzing outside, the kind of spot where truckers and locals mixed with the occasional out-of-towner looking for a cheap meal. Richard Hale, 34, sat at the counter, his suit sharp enough to make the whole place feel dingy. His face, all angles and arrogance, didn't bother hiding what he thought of everyone else. The guy who sneered, a stocky man with a flashy watch and a polo shirt stretched over his gut, leaned back in his booth grinning at his two buddies. They were regulars, the kind who tipped small and talked big like they owned the world. "Hey, if this story's grabbing, you do something for me. Pull out your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and maybe subscribe to the channel. It means everything to share these moments with you, to feel like we're in this together. All right, let's keep going." The diner was alive that night, a Friday crowd spilling in after midnight. Truckers nursed coffees, college kids laughed too loud over fries, and a few suits like Richard sat out of place, their polished shoes tapping the floor. Richard had no bodyguards, which was strange for a guy whose name was on billboards and tech headlines. People whispered he was here to feel real life, like he was slumming it, for a story to tell his rich friends. To them, Sophie was invisible, just a pair of hands refilling cups. The guy with the watch, who called himself Tony, wasn't done. "Sweetheart," he called, his voice carrying over the clatter of plates, "you ever think about doing something with your life? Or is this it?" His buddies chuckled, one slapping the table, his beer sloshing. Sophie paused, her hand on a pitcher of iced tea. She looked at Tony, her eyes clear, not a flicker of shame. "This pays my bills," she said, soft but steady, and moved to the next table, her tray balanced like it was part of her. A woman in a corner booth, her designer purse perched like a trophy, watched Sophie with a smirk. She was in her 40s, her hair dyed a perfect blonde, her nails manicured to a glossy red. She leaned toward her friend, a thin woman in a silk scarf, and said loud enough for Sophie to hear, "Look at her apron. She probably wears that thing to bed." The friend laughed, a sharp practice sound, and added, "Bet she's never even seen a real restaurant." Sophie was refilling a sugar shaker nearby, her fingers steady, but she paused just for a heartbeat, her jaw tightening. She didn't look at them, just kept twisting the cap back on the metal, scraping softly. The women kept going, their voices dripping with fake pity. "Poor thing stuck here forever," the first one said, shaking her head. Sophie set the shaker down, her movements precise, and walked away, her head high, leaving their words hanging in the air like smoke. Richard watched her, his coffee steaming in front of him. He leaned forward, elbows on the counter, his Rolex glinting under the diner's harsh lights. "Girl," he said, his voice low, like he was sizing her up. "Work in a place like this. You don't aim high, do you?" It wasn't a question, more like a jab, and it hung in the air. A couple of college girls at a nearby table, their hair dyed bright and their nails tapping their phones, giggled. "She's probably stuck here forever," one whispered loud enough for Sophie to hear. Sophie didn't react, just wiped the counter with a rag, her movement smooth like she'd heard it all before. "Dreams don't keep the lights on," she said. Not looking at Richard, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the noise. Richard's eyebrows twitched like he wasn't used to answers that didn't beg for his approval. Tony wasn't letting it go. He was the kind of guy who thrived on attention. His watch probably worth more than Sophie's rent. He pulled out a $10 bill, crumpled it, and tossed it onto the floor near her feet. "There's your tip, darling," he said, his grin wide, his buddies roaring with laughter. One of them, a skinny guy with a goatee, snapped a photo with his phone, probably for some group chat where they'd mock her later. The diner got quieter, heads turning, waiting to see what she'd do. Sophie stopped, her tray still in one hand. She looked at the bill, then at Tony. Slowly she bent down, picked it up and set it back on their table, right in front of him. "You dropped this," she said, her voice, even her eyes locked on his. Tony's grin faltered, his buddies going quiet. She turned away, her steps steady like nothing had happened. A teenage busboy, all elbows and acne, fumbled a stack of plates nearby, his eyes darting to Sophie as he scrambled to clean up. He was new, barely a month on the job, and the other servers said he was clumsy, always dropping something. He muttered an apology to no one in particular, his cheeks red, but Tony's table zeroed in on him. "Hey, kid," Tony called, his voice sharp. "You and this waitress make a great pair, both useless." The busboy froze, a plate slipping from his hands, shattering on the floor. Sophie, wiping a table nearby, stopped. She walked over, knelt beside the kid, and started picking up the pieces, her hands quick but gentle. "It's just a plate," she said, her voice low, meant only for him. The kid nodded, his hands shaking, and whispered, "Thanks, Sophie." She gave him a small nod, her eyes steady, and stood brushing the shards into a bin, while Tony's laughter echoed behind her. Richard's frown deepened, his fingers tapping the counter. He wasn't used to people like Sophie. Most folks would have scrambled to please him, flashed a smile, or at least looked nervous under his stare. She didn't. She moved through the diner like she belonged. Not loud, not showy, just surer. He sipped his coffee, then set it down, the cup clinking softly. "If a chance to change your life came," he said loud enough for her to hear as she passed, "would you take it?" Sophie stopped, turning to face him. Her eyes, calm and unshaken, held his for a moment. "If it came," she said, "I'd do what's right." It wasn't what he expected. He opened his mouth, then closed it, watching her walk away to clear a table. The air in the diner felt heavier now, like everyone was waiting for something. 3 regulars at a corner booth. Guys in their 40s with weathered faces and loud voices were watching Sophie too. They came in every week, always complaining about the food, but never leaving. The leader, a guy in a red cap with a permanent sneer, leaned forward. "She's only good for wiping tables," he said, loud enough for half the diner to hear. "Look at those shoes. Bet she's got nothing going for her." His friend, a wiry guy with a fake gold chain, laughed. "Probably lives in a trailer park, scraping by." The third guy tossed a crumpled napkin toward her, missing her by inches. Sophie's fingers tightened on her tray just for a second, but she kept moving, stacking plates, her face unreadable. Then the door slammed open, the bell above them jangling like a warning. 2 men burst in ski masks, pulled tight over their faces, one waving a handgun, the other clutching a knife that glinted under the lights. "Everybody down." The gunman shouted, his voice raw with adrenaline. Screams erupted. Chairs toppled as people dove under tables. A glass shattered, water spilling across the floor. The college girls screamed, clutching each other, their phones forgotten. Tony and his buddies ducked behind their booth, their bravado gone. Richard froze, his hands gripping the counter, his face pale, his Rolex suddenly meaningless. For the first time, he looked like just another guy, small and scared. Sophie, though, didn't move. She set her tray down, slow and deliberate, her eyes locked on the robbers. A young mother at a nearby table, her toddler squirming in a high chair, let out a choked sob, trying to unbuckle the straps with trembling hands. The knife guy turned, his blade twitching, and snapped, "Shut that kid up, or I will." The mother froze, her hands fumbling, tears spilling down her cheeks. Sophie stepped forward, her body angled to block the toddler from the robber's view. She knelt briefly, picking up a dropped toy, a small plastic truck, and handed it to the toddler, who quieted, clutching it. "You're okay," Sophie said softly to the mother, her voice steady, her hand brushing the woman's arm for just a moment. The mother nodded, her sobs quieter, and Sophie stood, turning back to the robbers, her stance calm but ready. The gunman swung his weapon toward her, his hand shaking. "You, sit down, you cheap waitress," he barked. "Who do you think you are?" The knife guy laughed, stepping closer, his blade twitching in his hand. A little girl near the door, maybe 6, whimpered her mom, pulling her close, their faces white with fear. Sophie stepped forward, putting herself between the girl and the robbers. The room gasped. The red cap regular, half hidden under his table, shouted, "Don't you idiot. You'll get us all killed." Richard, still gripping the counter, hissed, "What the hell are you doing?" Sophie didn't answer. She just stood there, her stance shifting, knees bending, hands loose at her sides, like she was ready for something. The knife guy lunged, his blade aimed at her chest. Sophie moved like she'd done it 1,000 times, sidestepping, grabbing his wrist and twisting it hard. The knife clattered to the floor, and before he could react, she drove her elbow into his jaw. He dropped out cold, his mask slipping. The gunman swung toward her, cursing, but Sophie was already moving, closing the distance in 2 steps. She grabbed the barrel, redirected it upward, and swept his legs out from under him. He hit the floor with a thud, the gun skidding across the linoleum. Sophie pinned him with her knee, her hands steady as she held his arms down. The whole thing took 15 seconds, maybe less. The diner was silent except for the little girl's sobs and the sound of heavy breathing. Nobody moved. The college girls peeked out from under their table, eyes wide, one of them clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. Tony was still crouched behind his booth, his watch catching the light, his face pale. Richard stared, his mouth open, his coffee long forgotten. The regulars in the corner booth were frozen, their smirks gone, replaced by something like shame. Sophie didn't look at them. She kept her knee on the gunman's back, her voice low, as she spoke to the little girl's mom. "It's okay now. You're safe." The mom nodded, tears streaming down her face, her daughter buried in her arms. Sophie's uniform was wrinkled, a small tear at the hem from the scuffle, but she didn't seem to notice. An older man, a trucker with a gray beard and a flannel shirt, crawled out from under his table, his hands shaking as he stood. He'd been quiet all night, just sipping his coffee, but now his eyes were locked on Sophie, wide, with something like awe. "Lady," he said, his voice rough, "I don't know where you came from, but you just saved us all." He reached into his wallet, pulled out a crumpled 20, and pressed it into her hand, his fingers trembling. "That's for you, not the diner." Sophie looked at the bill, then at him, her face softening. "Keep it," she said, folding his fingers back over the money. "Just get home safe." The trucker nodded, his eyes wet, and stepped back like he didn't know what else to say. Police sirens wailed outside, getting louder. The manager, a nervous guy with a mustache and a sweat-stained shirt, poked his head up from behind the counter. "Sophie," he stammered, his voice shaking. Where did you learn that?" Sophie didn't look at him, her eyes still on the robbers. "I trained once," she said, her voice steady like it was no big deal. "To protect others." The words landed heavy, cutting through the diner's tension. Tony muttered something to his buddies, too quiet to hear, but his smirk was gone. The college girls were whispering now, one of them filming with her phone, her hands shaky. Richard's eyes hadn't left Sophie, his knuckles white on the counter. The police burst in their boots loud on the floor radios, crackling. They cuffed the robbers, one of them dragging the knife guy to his feet, still groggy. An officer, a stocky guy with a buzz cut and a badge that read Martinez, stopped short when he saw Sophie. His face changed like he had recognized someone he hadn't seen in years. "My God," he said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "Sergeant Anna Carter. I thought you retired." The room went dead silent. Every head turned to Sophie. Tony's jaw dropped, his buddies frozen. The college girls stopped filming, their phones lowering. Richard's coffee cup slipped from his hand, hitting the counter with a dull clink, coffee splashing. Sophie nodded, once her face unreadable. "I quit," she said. "I just want a quiet life now." Martinez shook his head, a half smile breaking through. "Quiet life? Yeah, right." He turned to the other cops, his voice low but carrying. "She was the best. Saved a whole unit once, took down 3 guys with nothing but her hands. Nobody moved like her." The diners started whispering, their voices a mix of awe and disbelief. The red-cap regular leaned toward his friend, his voice sharp. "She's still just a waitress," he said, trying to sound sure. "That was then. Now she's mopping floors." His buddy nodded, but his eyes darted to Sophie like he wasn't so sure anymore. Sophie was mopping now, cleaning blood off the linoleum, her movements slow and careful like it was just another night. A young server barely out of high school hovered near Sophie, her hands twisting in her apron. She'd been hiding in the kitchen during the robbery, her face still pale from fear. "Sophie," she whispered, stepping closer, I froze back there. I should have helped." Her voice cracked, her eyes darting to the floor, ashamed. Sophie stopped mopping, setting the handle against the counter. She looked at the girl, her expression soft but firm. "You stayed safe," she said. "That's what matters." The server nodded, biting her lip, and slipped a small bracelet, a cheap beaded thing, into Sophie's hand. "My sister made this," she said, barely audible. "For you." Sophie closed her fingers around it, her eyes steady, and nodded. The server hurried back to the kitchen, wiping her eyes. The little girl's mom approached, still holding her daughter's hand, her face streaked with tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking like she was trying to hold it together. Sophie looked up, her face softening for the first time. "Just glad you're okay," she said, and went back to mopping. The college girls were back on their phones, typing fast, probably posting about what happened. One of them glanced at Sophie, then away like she felt guilty for laughing earlier. Tony and his buddies were quieter now, their usual swagger gone, but they still didn't look at her. Richard, though, couldn't stop staring. He stood brushing off his suit and walked over to where Sophie was cleaning. "Sophie," he said, his voice different now, less sharp, less sure. She didn't stop mopping, but she glanced at him, waiting. He hesitated like he was choosing his words for the first time in years. "I need you," he said, loud enough for the diner to hear. The room froze. Tony's head snapped up, his buddies exchanging looks. The college girls stopped typing, their eyes wide. Even the cops paused, Martinez raising an eyebrow. Richard didn't seem to notice. He kept his eyes on Sophie. "Not because you saved me," he said, "but because you were the only one who acted when all of us froze." Sophie stopped mopping. She leaned the mop against the counter, her hands resting on her hips. She didn't say anything, just looked at him, her eyes searching his face like she was weighing him. Richard pulled a card from his pocket, plain white with just a name and number, no logo, no flash. He held it out. "From now on," he said, "you're my head of personal security." The diner felt like it stopped breathing. The manager's mouth fell open, his mustache twitching. The red cap regular choked on his coffee, his buddies staring. Tony laughed, but it was nervous, like he didn't believe it. Sophie took the card, looked at it for a moment, then slipped it into her apron pocket. "I'll think about it," she said, and went back to mopping. The next morning, the diner was quieter, the air different. Sophie was back, same uniform, same worn shoes, pouring coffee like nothing had happened. But people didn't look through her anymore. They whispered when she passed, not mocking, but curious, like they were seeing her for the first time. Tony didn't show up. Word was he'd been fired from his sales job after his boss saw the video of him tossing that $10 bill on the floor. It had gone viral, shared across social media, with captions calling him out. The college girls were back, but they didn't laugh this time. One of them left a 20 on the table, a real tip, and mumbled, "You were amazing," before hurrying out. The red cap regular and his buddies didn't show either. Rumor was they'd been dropped from their country club after the story spread their names tied to the diner incident. A local reporter, a young guy with glasses and a notepad, slipped into the diner that afternoon, his eyes scanning for Sophie. He approached her as she refilled salt shakers, his voice eager. "Miss Carter, just a quick word for the paper," he said, pen poised. "You're a hero. People want to know your story." Sophie didn't look up, her hands steady, as she twisted a cap on it. "No story here," she said, her voice polite but final. "Just doing my job." The reporter pushed, his voice rising. "But you're Sergeant Carter. You could be famous." Sophie set the shaker down, her eyes meeting his, calm but unyielding. "I don't need famous," she said, and walked away, leaving him standing there, his pen still. The other diners watched, some nodding like they understood. A sleek black car pulled up outside the diner that afternoon, the kind that didn't belong in a town like this. Richard's driver, a quiet guy in a dark suit, walked in and handed Sophie an envelope. She opened it at the counter, during her break, her coffee untouched. Inside was a contract, 6 figures, her name typed neatly at the top. She read it slowly, her face unreadable, then folded it and tucked it into her pocket. The manager watched, nervous, like he was afraid she'd walk out and never come back. She didn't say anything, just went back to wiping tables, her movements steady, as always. Later that day, Richard himself showed up. No tie this time, his suit jacket open, his face less guarded. People in the diner stared, some recognizing him from the news, others just sensing the shift in the room. He walked straight to Sophie, who was clearing a table, her tray stacked with plates. "You didn't call," he said, his voice low, not angry but direct. Sophie straightened, setting the tray down. "Been busy," she said, nodding toward the tables. He almost smiled, but it was quick gone before anyone else noticed. "I meant what I said," he told her. "You're not like anyone I've ever met." The diners were watching now, forks paused, conversations hushed. Sophie picked up her tray, her voice calm. "I don't need to be like anyone," she said, and moved to the next table. The whispers followed her for days. The local news ran a story digging up her past as Sergeant Anna Carter, the soldier who'd saved a unit in a firefight and walked away from it all for reasons nobody knew. The college girls' posts were everywhere, calling her a hero, their videos racking up views. Tony's career was done, his name dragged online, his buddies distancing themselves. The Redcap regular and his crew were persona non grata at their usual haunts, their social circle shrinking fast. Sophie didn't talk about it. She didn't post, didn't gloat, didn't even look at the news. She just kept working, her apron stained, her shoes scuffed her hands steady as she poured coffee. One evening as Sophie was stacking chairs after closing, the bell jingled. An older woman, a regular who always sat alone with a book, stood at the counter, her coat buttoned tight. "Sophie," she said, her voice soft but clear, "I saw what you did. Not just with those men, but every day. You don't let them break you." She slid a small photo across the counter, faded, showing a young woman in a similar uniform decades ago. "That was me," she said. "I know what it's like." Sophie looked at the photo, her fingers brushing the edge, then handed it back. "You made it through," she said, her voice steady. The woman smiled, her eyes bright, and left without another word. A week later, Sophie was wiping down the counter when a customer, an older woman with kind eyes, stopped her. "You're her, aren't you?" the woman said, her voice soft. "The one from the news." Sophie paused, her rag still in her hand. "Just doing my job," she said, and went back to wiping. The woman left a 50 on the counter, more than the bill, and walked out without another word. Sophie slipped the money into the tip jar, splitting it with the other servers. The manager, still nervous, started treating her differently, offering her extra shifts, asking her opinion on the schedule. She just nodded, didn't make a fuss. Richard's car came back a few days later. This time, he didn't get out. The driver handed Sophie another envelope, thicker this time. She opened it in the break room, away from the diner's eyes. Inside was a revised contract, more detailed, with a note in Richard's handwriting, "Whenever you're ready." She folded it, tucked it away, and went back to work. That night, as she walked home under the streetlights, her uniform still on the town, felt different. People nodded at her, some saying her name, Sophie, not Anna. The diner's neon sign buzzed behind her, but it didn't feel like a cage anymore. The story spread beyond the town. A news crew showed up wanting an interview. Sophie turned them down, her voice polite but firm. "I'm not here for that," she said, and kept pouring coffee. The college girls stopped coming, but their posts kept circulating, their apologies public. Now, one of them admitting she'd been wrong to laugh. Tony's face was on a local blog, his job loss tied to his behavior that night. The Redcap regular was seen at a gas station alone, his head down, no longer welcome at his old haunts. Sophie didn't talk about any of it. She didn't need to. One night, as Sophie locked up the diner, Richard was waiting outside, leaning against his car. The street was quiet, the air cool. "You still haven't called," he said, his voice softer than before. Sophie slung her bag over her shoulder, her shoes scuffing the pavement. "Didn't know I had to," she said, not looking at him. He stepped closer, his hands in his pockets. "You don't," he said. "But I'm asking." She stopped, turning to face him, her eyes steady. "Why me?" she asked, her voice low, like she was testing him. He didn't hesitate. "Because you're the only one who didn't freeze," he said, "and I trust that—" Sophie didn't answer right away. She looked down the street where a beat-up sedan passed, its engine rattling, reminding her of the car her dad used to drive when she was a kid. She adjusted her bag, her fingers brushing the envelope inside. "I'll let you know," she said finally, and started walking. Richard watched her go, his car still idling, the driver waiting. He didn't call after her. He didn't need to. The diner's lights flicked off one by one, the neon sign going dark. Weeks passed, and Sophie kept working, her life unchanged on the surface. But the town saw her differently. Customers left bigger tips, said her name when they thanked her. The manager stopped hovering, started trusting her to close up alone. The news stories faded, but the truth lingered. Tony's life unraveled, his social media accounts gone quiet, his name a cautionary tale. The Redcap regular was spotted at a bar, alone, his buddies nowhere in sight. The college girls moved on their posts, buried under newer trends. But their respect for Sophie stuck, one of them sending her a handwritten note left with the manager. One night, as Sophie swept the diner floor, the bell jingled. Richard walked in alone again, his suit less formal, his face tired but open. The few customers left looked up, then away, sensing something private. He sat at the counter waiting until she finished sweeping. "You're still here," he said, not a question. Sophie leaned the broom against the wall, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's my shift," she said, her voice even. He nodded like he expected it. "The job's still yours," he said. "No pressure. Just, I see you, Sophie." She looked at him, her eyes searching, then nodded once. "I see you too," she said, and poured him a coffee. Sophie didn't take the job right away. She kept the contract in her bag, reading it sometimes when the diner was quiet. Her life went on, her shoes still scuffed, her uniform still stained. But she wasn't invisible anymore. She was the woman who'd stood up, who'd moved when everyone else froze. She had changed a billionaire's mind, not by trying, but by being herself. And as she walked home one night, the stars bright above the truth was clear. She'd always been more than they thought. They just hadn't seen it until now. You've been there, haven't you? Judged, dismissed, made to feel like you didn't belong. Sophie's story is yours too. You kept going, stayed quiet, held your ground. You weren't wrong. You weren't alone. The truth always finds its way. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.